There we go. So it is my pleasure to be able to introduce to you Dr. Bernard Bull, who is an associate professor of education and assistant vice president of academics at Concordia University, Wisconsin. Bernard is actually a Thrivent Fellow himself, now would call himself maybe a Lechner Fellow, depending, and is engaged with each of our cohorts for a substantial amount of time, and we really appreciate that. He holds a BA in History and an MA in Humanities, a Master's in Curriculum and Instruction, as an EDD is in Instructional Technology. I know I sent you all his website and information, but you're really going to enjoy listening to Bernard as he talks about different ways we can look at our educational models, different ways to think about being an entrepreneur within our work, the implications of these changes in technology, both on education, our lives, and society. So it's he's going to stretch your mind. How's that sound? And Bernard, I am sending, as soon as I find you on my list here, you are now the host. And again, thank you for being with us. And off you go.
Great, thanks. Thanks for having me. Is it okay? And I looked at the list of participants, but is it okay if just as I get going here, if people could briefly introduce themselves and maybe the role that they have at their institution?
Absolutely.
I'll start. I'm Tim Yeager. I work at Concordia University out in Irvine, California, and I'm Executive Vice President for University Advancement.
I'm Megan Boslow, and I work at Concordia in Portland, and I am the Vice President for Student Affairs and the Chief Academic Officer. No, sorry, not Chief Academic Officer, Chief Student Affairs Officer.
You can just be chief of everything.
Whatever they tell me to do today.
President of the world.
No.
Rick Wilson. Oh, go ahead.
Yvonne Petrie. I'm at Luther College at the University of Regina in Canada. And I'm a history professor and have been a dean for 2.5 months. I started as the college dean in July.
Prior college dean who went through the Lechner program as well at your school.
Do you know Volker?
Yes, we went through the fellows program together.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, no, he's been a great role model.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm Stephen Jindrejczyk. I'm the Director of Marketing at Augsburg University.
I'm Rick Wilson, Chair of the Education Leadership Program at Concordia University in St. Paul.
I'm Steve Chelgren at Gustavus Adolphus College, the AVP of Auxiliary Services.
I'm Pat Tucson. I'm the COO and CFO of Lutheran Social Service of Minnesota.
Great.
Bernard, I'm Ryan Peterson. I'm your colleague, just a few miles away, and campus pastor assistant to the president, Concordia.
Hello, I am Sarah Kellogg, and I am with Concordia University in St. Paul, and I'm the Director of Continuing Studies.
Shoki, I'm the Assistant Professor of Computer Science at Concordia University, Texas, and I'm also kind of like an Assistant Dean, I guess, is to describe that role.
Hi, I'm Lisa Bono, and I'm the Director of the Bachelor's Degree for Professionals program at California Lutheran University.
Great.
My name is Mike Miller. I'm signing on. I'm going to be on next month. I was in the first group, and my roommate was the president of Cal Lutheran, and I was at Davidson. Steve. I'm going to be listening in and trying to figure out how to meet the needs. Thanks.
Mike, right. Just to give you some feedback, it's hard to hear you. You kind of go in and out.
Okay, I will do my best to speak up, but largely I'm just unmuting here.
All right. Well, great. That's helpful. Thank you. I appreciate the context and a little bit of background, get a sense of where you're all coming from. To share a little bit more, I was introduced already, but actually my role did change. I forgot to give you that update, Tom. As of January, so I've been in it since January, I serve as Vice Provost for Curriculum and Academic Innovation. So essentially we moved to a provost model, so all the academic operations essentially moved over to me, except for kind of the faculty hiring part of that and the faculty scholarship part as well didn't come over to me. So I work with, originally I served as Assistant Vice President of Academics and grew our online initiative at the university. We are one of the few more liberal arts colleges that actually built a team internally. We didn't outsource or contract with an outside group, so we have a team of 30 plus that run our online operation, and we grew from a few hundred to a few thousand in about 5 years. And I also work with our extended campus more broadly, so we have our off-campus centers. The continuing education unit reports to me, and then we have a lot of institutes like Bioethics Institute, Women's Leadership Institute, things like that. And then in my other role, I work with anything that has to do with curriculum or academic innovation, managing the research on new program development, serving kind of as a liaison between admission, marketing, and academics so that we kind of have that trifecta that leads to successful launches of new programs. And I get to work with almost every unit in the university in one way or another at some point. And so that's a lot of fun. I enjoy that. I don't get a lot of interaction with the students like I used to, but this other stuff is kind of fun. So in terms of my scholarship, though, I've been blessed, and the president here has given me an immense amount of flexibility to work with outside organizations. I've actually, I graduated from college when I was 22, and by 25, I started a consulting business. I was teaching full-time as a theology teacher in high school, but I started my first consulting business was called Servant Innovations, and it was a company that helped nonprofit organizations prepare for the future. And at the time, it oftentimes helped them figure out how emerging technologies were going to potentially impact their business operations or be an amplifier for their mission, or possibly even be a muzzler for their mission and how they could respond. So I worked with, one of my first clients was a small Bible college in Illinois. I worked with a number of churches and agencies that supported different missionaries around the country. And it was great fun helping them devise digital age communication plans or develop new marketing strategies or examine or consider new models of teaching and learning or of reaching populations. And I kind of learned as I went. So, I'm 25 at the time, and I just loved learning and reading and learning about organizations. And that's really what launched into something that I've done and I do to this day. I get to use some of that knowledge and skill within my organization. But in full candor, a lot of what I do, I'm actually able to launch at other organizations better than my own sometimes. And we could maybe talk about that and how that works. And maybe you'll get into that in your culture conversation for next time. But what my work has dealt with more recently is what I call sort of the intersection of education, entrepreneurship, and innovation, and maybe digital culture. And I try to resist the title of futurist, but I do actually engage in future study. And that's something that I spend quite a bit of time on, figuring out what are the trends that are likely to stick in higher ed, and what are the ones that are just fads that are likely to fade. What are the things that are wise, that an organization is wise to invest in because it'll help amplify their mission and achieve their strategic goals? And what are the ones that are likely to lead them away if they're sort of enticed by them? And I use a pretty complex system to analyze trends. I've been blessed to develop a wide network that includes some pretty influential people around the country and other parts of the world, and they certainly help me get some behind the scenes information. But I also study trends in education, and I look for certain patterns. For example, one of the trends that's really neat to watch is what's called domain jumping, and another one's called level jumping. Domain jumping is whenever an initiative or an innovation starts in one field or discipline or area, and then it skips over to another. For example, a lot of educational technology that shows up in higher education actually started in other areas and other fields. It could have started anywhere from military training to just the larger business sector, to the entertainment industry at large, or somewhere else. And then it started getting repurposed. And in fact, that's oftentimes the way that some of these innovations happen. They start in the industries that are willing to fund them or invest in them the most. And that's why the entertainment industry oftentimes becomes a place to invest. Like a lot of the things we're seeing with high-tech innovations with virtual and augmented reality in education, a lot of that didn't start. I mean, there were early experiments in the military with augmented and virtual reality, but a lot of its funding came whenever it was being able to be used to begin to imagine next generation video games and gaming platforms and the like. And there's a lot of venture capital on that. So they can invest it and refine the innovation. And once it begins to develop, then they look for new markets to expand their influence and their share. And that's when they move to education, right? So I look at a lot of fun things like that. I love it. Level jumping is a little easier. It's looking at an innovation that might start in higher ed, and it jumps to K-12, or it starts in early elementary and jumps to higher ed. That'd be an example of something like the flipped classroom, which you've probably heard of. And the flipped classroom is an innovation that actually started on the graduate level in higher education, but within a matter of 4 years, jumped down to middle and high school, which refined it and perfected it, and then it jumped back to higher ed. And you can kind of watch those trends, and that gives you a sense of where things are going. I look at the maturation level of technology, the adoption rates, how it's being adopted, who's adopting it. I look for changing metaphors. When people's language starts to change around an innovation, that's oftentimes a pretty neat signal that something's going to happen. I look for amplifying technology, for funding growth, who's investing and why, and are they going to continue? I look for revenue potential because that impacts investors. I look for simplicity because easy ideas spread more easily than complex ideas. It has to be concrete enough for people to get their head around it for it to spread most of the time. I look for media attention, and I also look for what I call the kairos. For those who have a background in Greek, kairos can be defined as like the due season or the right time. It's like the perfect storm. It's when a number of conditions come together at just the right time that make it likely for something to happen that might not otherwise have happened. And then I look for policy changes that create fertile soil. So for example, right now, we are in an unprecedented time in higher education, where the Secretary of Education is considering making some policy changes that, if they do, could completely transform the nature of financial aid for higher education and can make it possible for any organization or any individual. I could start Bernard Bull University tomorrow and start offering courses and getting federal financial aid for it. And if that happens, all bets are off. It'll be really fun, though. This is the Wild West era of higher ed, and we'll all just have to innovate our way through it. I know we had one person working in continuing ed. It's a great time to be in continuing ed because you have more freedom and flexibility. You have less regulatory influence, so you can experiment and try things a little bit faster. So those are the factors that I play around with, and I'm consistently looking for these. And then I try to identify trends and patterns. And after I do all of that complex and fun sort of philosophical thinking, theoretical thinking, analysis, then I come back and I say, okay, now that I have this insight, what are the implications for my organization? What are the implications for another organization? Given where they are, given their unique mission, given the unique circumstances. And that's what I'd like to spend some time talking to you all about today, is just what are some of the trends that I see sticking, and what implications might they have for your organization? And I think you'll probably be getting into some change management conversations next time, but we can even talk about, well, what's it look like to try these out? And certainly, so hopefully you'll walk away with a few applied ideas along the way. So let me share one, and I'm going to go through and tell you a series of stories basically, and then we can talk about them. But the first trend that I'd like to kind of point out is, I'm kind of skipping here a little bit, is a failed experiment in higher education that started about 6 years ago. But in order to understand it, you have to go back. You have to go back even further, I suppose. How many are familiar with the name Sugata Mitra? Any of you heard of that name? Any of you listened to TED Talks? These are technology, entertainment, and design. They're these high-interest, inspirational thinkers and doers who get 10 to 20 minutes to tell an incredible story of something that they've done or something that's happening. And so they're really popular videos. And there was one, Sugata Mitra actually gave one on his story. But with Sugata Mitra, he's a scholar based in the UK, from India, did a lot of research on the education system in India. And he became intrigued by, what do you do in environments where there are no learning opportunities for young people? So there is no system of schools. You can try to launch schools, but they often don't take, and there are people just not getting the learning opportunities. So they're disadvantaged in a number of ways. So he wanted to experiment with alternative ways to help people grow and learn other than a standard school system. So what he did is he created a series of famous experiments called the hole in the wall experiments. And he took a computer with internet access, and he would go into a village and he would literally put it into a stone wall, not unlike kind of a wall behind me. He'd literally create a hole in the wall, and they would implant a computer and keyboard, oftentimes in English when some of the kids didn't even know English in the community. And it had internet access. And a group of students would gather around and they'd say, "What is this?" And he says, "I don't know. Why don't you check it out?" And they'd ask him questions, and he would always reply with a question instead of giving them an answer, and just invite them to inquire and to experiment. And then he would leave. And he would come back later, and he would see what the young people had done with this computer. And what he began to discover was that the students were actually self-organizing a learning experience. They were actually learning complex scientific concepts. They were learning English. They were learning all sorts of things. And there was no teacher. There was no formal curriculum. It was literally a device and internet access and a group of curious young people. And he began to develop a theory of what he called self-organized learning environments. And from that, it inspired any number of other interests around the world. This initial hole-in-the-wall experiment sparked the current craze and interest in what you've probably heard of as self-directed learning. Now, self-directed learning got its early traction in the 1930s and then again in the 1970s with Malcolm Knowles. But self-directed learning has gotten a lot of traction. In fact, I've written a number of books, and one of my books is actually on self-directed learning. And self-directed learning started getting a lot of traction around this self-organized learning environment, because the idea is, if schools are just producing people who are good at following instructions and following rules of others, we're really still stuck in a factory construct of education. And the problem is, our society isn't really seeking that type of employee, or if it is, it's one of the lower paying jobs available oftentimes. So what does it mean to create or nurture learners or young people who actually believe that their voice matters, who know how to organize their own learning, who can set learning goals, who can figure out ways to achieve those learning goals, who can create systems of feedback for themselves, who can monitor their progress along the way, and who can actually achieve learning. So how do we develop people who have agency and ownership in their own learning? And that's a huge conversation right now. So there are tons of experiments that have begun to emerge. There are community colleges around the country that have actually created self-directed learning environments. In some ways, I'd like to suggest that the competency-based education movement that gives more flexibility of time, pace, place, and pathway is fueled a little bit by this cultural shift and this value for self-directed learning and giving people more choice and flexibility. The digital world is fueling this because people can go online and they can self-organize their learning more easily than ever. I mean, I was just talking to someone yesterday he's 58 years old, and he's an engineer, process engineer, and he just discovered this amazing technology called YouTube. And he's blown away by it. And he's like, you can learn anything in this place. And he's figuring out how to build things, because he has a patent on on taking old windmills and repurposing them to provide energy for your house, and he's an innovator and an inventor, and he's blown away by how much learning can happen on YouTube. And of course, he's being told by others, yeah, that's kind of been around a while, but that's sort of the nature of the environment. And I'm bringing this up because this is a massive trend, and I don't think that higher ed institutions in general are paying enough attention to it and its potential implications. What you've probably already seen, if you're on the academic side, and if your school is open to it, is at our university, for example, I review any student who requests an individualized major. I will tell you that I have reviewed over 50 requests for individualized majors in the last 10 days. The growing number of students who are seeking to not just take a major out of the catalog, but to design something of their own choosing that fits their own goals and aspirations is growing at a rapid rate, especially with the students who are coming to college a little bit more prepared. And so we see a lot of that happening. And there was an example of in an old college called the Black Mountain College in Asheville, North Carolina, that actually took this idea and they decided to launch a college without courses, credits, degrees, programs, accreditation, or any of the regular trappings. Essentially, it was a place where people could gather and self-organize their learning. And they actually worked for about 3 years. Of course, they had an anonymous billionaire to fund their experiment. That doesn't hurt. We all like that. But it was actually working. Unfortunately, it did unravel into a bit of chaos, and it looked a little bit more like Animal House by the end, and it ended up phasing out. It was a failed experiment, people would say, except that several of the people were influenced by that experiment, and 3 of them launched a new private school management organization called the Agile Learning Network, which is taking the agile project management process that's popular in computer programming and business and elsewhere, that uses this concept of kind of these 6-week cycles of work, and the concept of self-directed learning. And they've created a network of what I think is now 18 to 20 independent schools around the country. I know that's on the K-12 level. Was that a failed experiment? Or was it an experiment that provided actionable insight that people then turned into a successful experiment down the road? And I'm going to come back to that because I think that's important. So one trend that I'd offer that's worth noting as I look at it is a strong one, is this concept of self-directed learning. I do think that it's going to challenge us to reimagine how we think about our teaching and learning. Now, I'm talking way more than I intended, so I'm just going to pause and give people a chance to think out loud with me or to follow up with some questions, and then we'll go from there.
Bernard, I know you said, this is Sarah, I know you said one of the trends that you're watching and one that I think so.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So I recently completed my doctorate degree and my dissertation was on competency-based education. So I have a great interest in that. What are the trends that you predict in the future? And with so many schools trying it, how many of them are going to be sustaining that?
Yeah, so Concordia, Wisconsin is actually a member of the Competency-Based Education Network. We were the second cohort, one in the second cohort to join. And we actually launched the first master's degree program in the nation built around competency-based digital badges. And we use a course-based competency-based model. You probably know what that is. Others might not know, but for your sake. And so I've been following this one pretty closely from a couple of different angles. There are a couple of possible directions for CBE. The Competency-Based Education Network and a number of other groups who are interested in this innovation have been moving more and more toward having really strong traditional objective measures for competence, right? And that's been a really strong push. And I would argue that that push is to defend the movement, to defend the competency-based movement, because our accreditation, the policies and our accreditation systems and the U.S. Department of Education, the language, as you know, is written in a way that doesn't really work for competency-based education. There's still language about credit hours and seat time and things that don't necessarily make as much sense in the world of CBE or competency-based education. So a lot of it depends in part upon how those policies change or whether they do. And there are groups that are obviously working really hard in advocacy in a few different ways. Now, early on, people were working to advocate for giving in schools more flexibility to offer competency-based education, to not have to worry about the seat time rules and things like that. The more recent shifts I've seen, however, with some of the leaders in the CBE movement, is actually they've backed off from that. In some ways, they want to maintain a level of structure because they're afraid of letting this get out of the box and anyone and their grandmother starting a competency-based education school and getting federal funding if what I talked about before happens. So this is one that is a bit of a wait and see in terms of what's going to happen on the policy side. I will say that I see a new development in competency-based education that's very heartening and interesting to me, which is that a lot of the early CBE stuff was people were so focused on using these objective tests and these assessments. And I'm seeing a lot more creativity and interest in new authentic approaches to assessment, and even more portfolio approaches. So for example, our ed tech program, we don't have any objective assessments. We actually, the learners, it's all project-based and mastery learning. So learners have authentic real-world work projects that they complete, and we review them and we give them feedback, and they can resubmit them as many times as needed until they meet the minimum requirements. And then we recognize them with a digital badge that's tied to a national job database that shows them what jobs they're more qualified for now that they've reached that skill level. It's kind of cool. And I'm seeing more people become interested in that kind of conversation around CBE, which is really heartening to me. It makes it a bit more authentic. Here's the part, and I'll stop after this. The other part about CBE that I think is really fascinating is there are movements in the workforce development world around how we can help employers fill the employment gaps that they see. And in the past, employers oftentimes put a job posting out there and they have something like minimum degree requirement bachelor's or associates. And that's fine. And when you interview the employers, well, why did you put a bachelor's there? Is a bachelor's really required in order to do that job? And I've actually done the research, and when I do an audit or a task analysis of the jobs in these workplaces, a bachelor's degree is not necessary in order to do the job effectively. So why are they posting bachelor's degree required? Anyone want to guess?
They want people with the basic skills that the employers talk about, the soft skills. They want people who can problem solve, who can be critical thinkers.
Yeah, that's one of the things that some people say, but when I push it further to the HR office, because what we find is actually there's sometimes not a significant difference in some of those soft skills between someone who has a degree and someone who doesn't. It varies. Mm-hmm. So the issue that the HR office comes to is actually it's an easy way to separate the wheat from the chaff. Mm-hmm. It's an easy vetting tool. So if they open the doors to anyone, they're going to get anyone. And a lot of them will be so underqualified that it's a waste of their time to review the applications. Like that's how they describe it. And so if they just put a degree, these people have at least shown that they have to show up for class. They've passed classes. They've had to complete work. So there are those kinds of soft skills that they feel like they vet for. But they might not actually have all of the skills that they want for them to thrive in the workplace. So what's happened is there's a think tank called Markle. I did a little consulting work for them, and they've launched an initiative in Colorado called Skillful. What Skillful does is they work with employers, and they help employers create a competency-based approach to hiring. So instead of hiring people on the basis of the degrees they have, they create hiring funnels that vet people based upon whether they have key competencies that are considered necessary to get that job. And now you're leveling the playing field. Doesn't matter whether you have a PhD or you're self-taught like Abraham Lincoln. You can apply for that job and you go through a series of hiring tests or funnels to see whether you're qualified for the job. And I've even been doing, I actually had a meeting with the U.S. Department of Ed last week on this because I'm doing some experiments on what I call challenge-based hiring funnels. And this is actually, when you ask about competency-based education, this I see as one of the more promising futures of CBE, is looking at how it's going to connect directly with hiring funnels in companies and organizations. So I think that for those higher ed institutions who are getting into CBE, they're wise to also be thinking about building corporate partnerships who can help them pilot these kinds of challenge-based hiring systems. And it's going to allow, it's going to skip and in some ways bypass a lot of the political debate that's happening around CBE. I'll just kind of pause there. That was a long answer to your question.
Well, I don't know if this is being devil's advocate. I guess as someone working in higher education, I'm a little bothered by this trend. I would give the same response as Sarah. It's that we hope our bachelor students do come out, well, and I think we believe they do, that they do come out with skills that employers are looking for. So I guess to me, what you're saying isn't actually good news. I don't know if there's a way you can explain it that will make me a little more hopeful.
Well, yeah, and I actually am a history undergrad. I have a humanities background. So I certainly am a strong champion for the liberal arts. I will say this, though. If I'm looking at it as an objective, trying to be as objective as possible, and I'm just describing the trends, and I'm giving recommendations to organizations on if they're involved in this, how they might want to position it in order to be successful or not, that's where kind of my last response and my comment came from. I would say that for those of us that are interested in the liberal arts and the humanities, that the days in which people just assumed that it was a good are likely to be fading. That we will, that it will be necessary for us to build a compelling case and strong, solid evidence in a way that's digestible to people outside of higher ed as to the value of what we're offering. And we'll have to be willing to venture into conversations that might even be comfortable as they even start wanting to know the return on investment, and they start using other language that we're not necessarily always comfortable with in some circles in higher education. So I certainly see actually ample room for the liberal arts in this, but we do have to find some new ways to communicate that in this new landscape.
Bernard, this is Rick Jepson from Concordia University in St. Paul. The midterm elections, I just look at if this is discussions going on at that level, I would guess the next 2 years would allow some of those ideas to be implemented. And what kind of PAC money do you think is being poured in to make this shift? I know in the K-12 world, PAC money going into bringing less restrictions, more charters, more options, more voucher approaches. That we see coming? Could a twist in the midterm elections shift this? If it stays as it is right now, more likely that it would probably move forward in a more trend that you're talking about, or how elections and PAC money, how are those two impacting the decision making going forward at a national level?
Your audio was coming in and out a little bit, so I didn't get
sorry.
all of it, but I think I got the gist of it. Tell me if I'm way off. Yeah, certainly the Secretary DeVos has been a strong advocate for choice and opening things up more, and so if I mean in this current landscape, that's where a lot of things are happening, kind of on that level. And not only that, but I have evidence I can't share directly, but there is clear and strong pressure from the U.S. Department of Education on the regional accrediting bodies to be an arm, an area, a means of their influence. So the U.S. Department of Ed there is some really interesting and potentially conflicting efforts on the U.S. side of things here. So I'm not sure where it's going to play out. I would say, for example, in the Obama administration, the strong trend was toward tuition-free higher education. And I suspect that we're likely to see a growing amount of that on the state level. I mean, going back to the concept of states as incubators and places of experimentation for innovations that might scale to a federal level, that we're going to see a lot of those state level innovations under the current administration or more Republican influence. And if it switched over to stronger national Democratic influence, we'd probably see a quicker shift to trying to take some of those experiments and adopt them on a national level in terms of tuition free, which is going to certainly challenge many of us those of us that are tuition dependent in terms of how we balance the budget and all. So that's kind of where I see the most significant implication of in terms of political shifts.
Thank you. Bernard, this is Bernard. Can I ask a question, please?
Please do.
Yeah, this is Mike Miller. I hear what you're saying, and so could you talk a little bit about the negotiation? This program has developed leaders who take responsibility for institutions that have been around and find themselves in your context. So can you talk a little bit about the negotiation between kind of mission and niche, for one, of an institution that someone in this program might take responsibility for, kind of the capacities and strengths, unique strengths within that institution, and then thirdly, this kind of notion of what the macro trends are, and how do you make decisions about that? Obviously, leading an institution into the deep water that doesn't have the capacity to succeed in one thing or another might cause catastrophe. But on the other hand, there are other errors that might be there. So kind of mission, capacity, and trend, how do you negotiate that as a leader?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think I get into that a little bit later too, with just a few other ideas I want to talk about. But I think that that's obviously distinct. The starting point, and my first book kind of tackled this topic a little bit, is I would advocate for what I call mission-minded innovation. And mission-minded innovation starts with the first questions of clarifying your mission and your core values and your identity as an organization, and then asking questions about, how does that position, what are the trends that would allow us to amplify that mission and those core values? What are the trends that are emerging that we want to attach to, that we believe are going to be most significant? And that first bit of research was based upon studying initially over 100 organizations, and I expanded it to well over 300 now, and well over 1,000 interviews, looking at leaders of innovative organizations. And I looked at a lot of K-12 schools, nonprofit organizations, some higher ed institutions, and looking for patterns. And what was really consistent is not only how they innovated, but the innovations that they chose to ignore, like they skipped. So the idea is, first of all, the traits of innovation were not earth-shattering. It was innovative to that organization, but not necessarily innovative to the world. They were attaching to, they started with what I call an unavoidable, undeniable school or organization shaping concept. So they begin to clarify what is a concept that is truly unavoidable, undeniable, and truly shaping of our particular school's identity. And so, for example, in the K-12 space, you might find a Montessori school, and they have a distinct pedagogy that is truly unavoidable, undeniable, and school shaping. You could not be a traditional classroom lecturer and apply for a teaching position at a Montessori school and walk in and stand up at the podium and just lecture all day. It just doesn't work. The culture doesn't allow that. It's unavoidable. To teach in a Montessori way is unavoidable and undeniable. And that philosophy is truly, it permeates everything in that organization. It's school shaping by nature. And I often encourage, and this is what emerged, the schools that were thriving and really riding the waves of innovation to amplify their mission were the ones that thought in this way. They started with truly building and defining that unavoidable, undeniable school shaping concept. And at most, they would have 2 or 3 of them. Now, I've gone back and forth with people on this too. People would often say, well, one of ours, we're a Christian organization, so the Christian mission is one of our unavoidable, undeniable school-shaping concepts. And I push back on that a little bit, only to say, is it really? Is it unavoidable? Are people able to be hired and kind of step out and hide and do their own thing separate from that core mission? If so, that's not the school-shaping concept for you. If you do your hiring practices, are they all aligned with this? And certainly there can be a handful of rare exceptions, but for the schools that really pop, that really ride these innovations, they're incredibly tough-minded about these few key concepts. And I would say that in this current landscape, with all the innovation, all the things that are changing, if anything, if you could be a champion or an advocate for identifying and amplifying an existing school-shaping concept, or helping to introduce and lead people toward a school-shaping concept, which, by the way, is incredibly difficult. It's really hard to do. It's easier if you're launching something new, but really hard if you're in an existing organization. It's easier to find something in the existing culture and tease it out and strengthen and amplify it. But if you can take that and truly make it a stronger, more defining concept, then you have your centerpiece for innovation. Then you begin to, what I consider that is a sifter. Everything else that you do, you sift through the unavoidable, undeniable school-shaping concept. And whatever goes through is the chaff, and it goes away, even if it's the coolest trend or technology you can imagine. And if it stays in the sifter, that's a keeper, right? That's the kind of thing that you want to keep. You're mining for gold. You're looking for the gold nuggets of innovation. The danger is the group that says, we're building a culture of innovation. And in doing so, you encourage everyone to innovate left and right. And it's just people running around chasing shiny objects left and right. And the shiny objects may or may not amplify their mission. And they may actually detract them from doing their current work with quality, because they're just pursuing so many different things. So I've increasingly become a really strong advocate for careful, mission-minded, strategic innovation, which kind of leads me to what I'd say is, as you're navigating a lot of these different trends, building a culture of experimentation strikes me as a really valuable consideration. So a culture of experimentation rather than the culture of innovation would be that you have and this fits very well with Tom's article, that you build a truly curious culture. You invite people to be curious, to say, I wonder what would happen if. And you ask that about teaching and learning. You ask it about financial innovations and changes, about student services or student success. And then you begin to produce, you devise a plan for short, quick, inexpensive experiments. Now, there's a great book on this by Michael Schrage called The Innovator's Hypothesis. And I've interviewed and talked to Michael Schrage. He's housed at MIT, I believe, still. And he even argues 5 people, 5 days to devise the experiments. And you try to get like 5 different experiments to run at your organization at the same time. And each of them with a maximum budget of maybe $5,000. And the purpose of the experiment is not to see if your new idea succeeds or fails, but it's to give you actionable insight about something you don't understand very well right now. So for example, suppose you're wondering about why is it that in our recruitment funnel with students, we keep losing students to other organizations, other schools. Like they come and they're interested in us, but then they keep choosing other people. And they usually do it within the first 3 months of meeting them. What is happening here? You might pose a testable hypothesis. You establish a hypothesis and you say, well, I believe that a personal connection makes a real difference in those early months. And that many times students are just filling out lots of forms online and there's no real person or connection. And right now, whenever I look at our practices, our average admission counselor takes up to 2 weeks to have a personal conversation with a prospective student. So let's devise an experiment with a set group of people. And let's see what happens if whenever we have a personal, meaningful conversation that lasts more than 15 minutes, and we do it with video so we can see each other, and we do it, and we're going to try this pilot with a group of 50 leads, and we're going to see if that has a significant impact upon whether or not students choose us or enroll. So very clear, specific, testable hypothesis. You create a simple experiment. And then at the end, it's not like, hey, this worked, let's implement it university-wide. It's, okay, what did we learn from this experiment? And you gain an actionable insight. And then you might conduct a second experiment to refine your practice. And by your third experiment, if you tend to get some useful, actionable insights, it oftentimes leads to an initiative that's worth pursuing, perhaps college-wide or university-wide. So this kind of approach allows you to remain faithful to your mission while embracing a variety of new innovations and experiments, while cultivating that culture of curiosity and preventing you from just chasing every shiny object. Again, a long answer, but I'll stop and see if there are any reactions to that.
Hey, Bernard, just maybe a follow-up to that. Do you have any good examples from Concordia, Wisconsin, and especially your interactions of the culture of experimentation rather than innovation?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of that work on the online space, in the online space, and when we have the Office of Continuing and Distance Education. So we actually did a lot of experimentation early on with recruitment, very similar to what I talked about. We did lots of short, quick, inexpensive experiments. How does texting impact student responses or conversion rates versus a phone call versus an email? So we had a simple experiment of 3 different pools with an initial contact in each of those ways. We did a lot of early experiments on the number of contacts, on who contacted them first, whether it was a dean or an admission counselor or a faculty member. So those are really simple. Like, there's nothing that earth-shattering. We're just being curious and testing a lot of this. So we did a lot of experiments on that front. In terms of academics, we did a lot of experiments early on to try to increase the quality of faculty feedback on student homework. So we had instances where faculty were delaying too much in giving quality feedback. And the policy is within 48 hours, but students often wanted feedback even faster. So we did one experiment where we created a simple tool that allowed faculty to record their feedback by audio instead of having to write feedback. It was actually incredible. The students reviewed their feedback 3 to 4 times as much when it was in audio than when it was in writing. They were more likely to apply the feedback to a second draft of their work, and the students felt a stronger social connection to the faculty member whenever it was provided audio. We also found that many of our faculty members who were very strong oral communicators, and they were great face-to-face teachers, but bad online teachers when it came to feedback, actually improved their performance night and day, because they were able to leverage their voice in order to give feedback. And we found that faculty, on average, were giving 3 times as much feedback. They were more likely to include examples and illustrations in their feedback, and they were more likely to take a posture of coaching and mentoring than a posture of evaluating and judging. And so those were all really fascinating insights that we used to then begin to think about next practices. So those are a couple of examples. I could go on because this is really what we've tried to do, is just build experiment upon experiment upon experiment. And I will tell you, though, that just because it was an experiment that looked like a success, that does not mean that we scaled it to university-wide. There are other cultural factors. Sometimes we didn't have the money or the resources. Sometimes I didn't have adequate buy-in from senior leadership. Sometimes I didn't, there are other things. And in full candor, sometimes then I publish it and some other university will take it and run with it because we weren't willing to. And that's kind of, as a scholar, that's the freedom that I have to do. Even our ed tech program built around competency-based digital badges, we were the first in the world to launch that program, but now there are 14 others who have basically imitated that or used it as a model, and some of them have scaled it to serving 1,000+ students, and we have 50. Does that help to kind of make it even more concrete?
Yeah, it does. And I appreciate you sharing, some of those experiments. You and I work in the same organization, and I was unaware of some of those experiments. So I think those are really good examples where they weren't university-wide, but they were quick hitters in order to evaluate.
Yeah, right. one of the dangers is, and so that for those who don't know, I had to make a tough call with our online growth. I was essentially charged by the president to grow it quickly and to move faster than the culture was ready to move. And so in analyzing the different innovation and change management models in existence, I felt like the only way to do it in the time frame that was given was to approach it using kind of a model based upon Clayton Christensen's work on disruptive innovation, which meant that I had to create an intentional silo, an entity that was separate from the larger culture at the university and was literally protected from the standard norms of the university and was given some freedoms and flexibilities not given to others in the university in order to launch it and grow it. And in doing so, we were able to grow something in 2 years that we probably would have not succeeded on in a decade otherwise. But it has its downfall, which is one that you just noted, Ryan, which is it's siloed innovations that aren't known or adopted or necessarily benefiting the larger organization sometimes. Now, I mean, in full candor, it generated tens of millions of dollars, over $50 million in net revenue for the university to invest in new building projects and all sorts of things in less than a 7-year period. So many people from a financial perspective would say, wow, this really helped amplify our mission in many other areas. And it even helps us to fund programs that maybe lose money annually. Now, I know we're just kind of going all over the place with questions, and I'm good with that. I'm kind of a nonlinear person, but I want to just identify a couple of other trends, and then we'll kind of finish up. One trend that I would feel remiss to ignore, which is the growth around analytics and big data. And many of you are probably experiencing it in many areas. And if you're interested, you can follow my blog. I've been writing a series on big data from different angles. And big data is going to influence and is influencing every stage of the student experience in higher education and data analytics. The first stage would be pre-enrollment. So how does a young person or a adult find out about your program and choose? Right now, there's a lot that's happening where people will, the true answer is they Google you in many cases, or by word of mouth. And yet, when you interview people about why they chose a school, they have largely unsophisticated and uninformed rationales for the school that they chose. It's amazing how many people believe that they chose a particular school because it was the most affordable, when in fact I could clearly identify a dozen others that were much more affordable. Or they would give other rationales and reasons. And that's because that's sort of how it works in the digital world and the word of mouth world. I'm going to make a prediction here that is going to be challenged with a competing approach. And I'd like to suggest that there's a changing metaphor happening around data and enrollment. The metaphor change is from sales to dating. The current dominant metaphor in the connection between students and instructors and schools right now is more of a sales metaphor in many places today, where they're thinking about it's almost like a product sales, and we're trying to convince them to buy what we have or to invest in what we're doing. But I would like to suggest that the metaphor is changing to one that's more dating. And in the dating metaphor, it's where you're feeling each other out and getting a sense of whether you might be compatible. Would this work or would this not work? And certainly from a Christian perspective, is this God's will or not? Or, other questions like that might be coming to play. And the reason I mention this around data is because there are now tools and technologies that are making this possible. Imagine a Match.com website where people go on and they find people they want to date. There are now a growing number of companies that are creating the equivalent of Match.com to help students find the college of choice. And it uses increasingly complex algorithms to recommend to students which colleges they think will be the best fit based on up to 300 individual indicators of a student's traits and background and experience. And some may look at that and think that sounds completely outrageous or problematic or whatever, but I would like to suggest that that is going to be a growing and potentially disruptive way of matching students with colleges in the future. And one example is a startup called Admittedly, which was bought by the National Research Center for College and University Admissions. A nonprofit bought them, and they've relaunched it as My Options. You can just check out the website My Options to get a sense of one of the kinds of technologies that are coming. And that's the data that's early on. But then we also move on to, once the students get enrolled, we have data about advising and recommending where students go. There are increasingly complex algorithms that are being used at places like Arizona State University and others that produce early alert warnings, like when a student has a certain number of traits that indicate that they're at risk of dropping out, and a trigger goes to a success coach to follow up with them. We actually have one of those built in at our university. We incubated it initially in our online, and now it's being applied and spread to other parts of the university. But we actually have a system that it's sort of a red, yellow, green light, and we have a series of about 60 indicators. And whenever a student is at risk of likely not persisting, the success coach comes in the morning, and they have a caseload that's been assigned to them, including people they need to follow up with that day. And we've found a significant increase in student retention through using these kind of data points. They certainly, if we had more time, I'd love to talk about the risks and the downsides of a lot of this stuff too. And I've written about that a lot as kind of a humanities guy. But then we also have the one that's going to be really challenging is we have algorithms that are being designed to teach complex concepts, especially in math and foreign language. And some of the math software is outperforming math teachers in terms of the outcomes of student learning. And these are algorithms that I don't know what that will look like, but that's something that for us to be thinking about. What happens whenever there is a company that's provided a option that can help people achieve a level of mastery in calculus or statistics in 6 months that your typical college selection of college courses is not doing. It's just not doing it. And it's doing it with a high level of success rate across populations. And that's the kind of thing that we'll be looking at. And this one sounds a little bit scary and way out there in the front. Tom said that I was going to stretch you, but there is technology now that on the basis of a snapshot of 5 photos from you can predict with over 87% accuracy your sexual orientation. And there is software that can follow micro expressions in your face and identify moods and levels of attention and levels of motivation. Right now, there's software that could track your faces and give me a real-time indicator of your level of skepticism or interest or support or lack thereof and all that kind of thing. And that is the next 10 to 15 years of innovation that we will see software doing that kind of work. And we'll be having the challenge of figuring out, well, what's the role of people? And I would argue that there's a huge role. But we have to be having that conversation about, okay, if this software is doing that work better than some people, what's the role of the people? What's the proper role? And I think there's still some really great work around mentoring and coaching and things like that. Now, I've already gone to the end of my time. Tom, I'm always bad at time management in these groups, but today especially. So I'll just pause, and maybe if there are any last question or two, and then we'll finish up here.
I actually need to sign off and get ready for a history course, so I'll say goodbye. But that was very thought-provoking, and I'll check out some of your sources. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I wondered if our expressions showed how hungry we are.
I have my lunch sitting right here waiting for me as soon as we're done.
Bernard, I did go and check out that website. It's fascinating for sort of like the dating game for college. So
and that's one of about 10 initiatives I know of. Yeah. In fact, the guy who started the Pearson Review, that company, he actually started a new series of companies, and his main goal is to become the Amazon.com of education choices. And he wants to build complex algorithms where we have one-stop destination point, and he would be in control of it. But he's taking on Google, because Google makes billions of dollars off universities buying ads and attention. And this would actually create an alternative to that. It actually save universities money if in one possible future.
I need to exit also, but this was fascinating, and thank you so much. And Tom, you're going to post this?
Yes, it's being recorded.
Okay.
So it takes us about a week to get it recorded because I start early and we kind of trim the ends off. And so probably by beginning or midweek next week, we'll have it posted.
This is great. Thank you so very much.
Great. I'm going to have to check out and run to my next meeting too, but I welcome, I'm happy to have follow-up chats with people on Zoom or Skype or whatever, and email correspondence as well. I'm going to be a little crazy busy the next week or two, but I will respond to you if you reach out to me.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Bernard. We appreciate it. Hey, Mike, Tom here. If you want to stay on and we can talk.